Think it's time we rise up, people. It's time's up, people. You can talk all you want, but it won't change a thing. I wanna know what you do.
Previously on the Up and Up with Jodi Newell.
In Georgia.
I'm sorry, can you slow down and just because that's not something that I've heard of before, and just my mind is going places. Registration by referral, what does that mean?
As in only people who are registered voters may refer to somebody who needs to be registered, and that's the only way they can get registered. So it's a way of keeping the system within that voter base. And that's just what Georgia did in 1877.
Looking at the Georgia laws, these laws weren't passed because of fraud. They were passed because people of color showed up. And that's what happened, you know? Just like in Reconstruction, we saw that the Black voting bloc was huge in Reconstruction time, because that was like the time period of our country where it was the most democratic. Over that period of time, they had to find ways to get around those laws. We end up with segregation. We end up with the Jim Crow era that led to, you know, a period of oppression that wasn't fixed until the 1960s. I know I'm jumping ahead, but
Jim Crow is not something that just happened to be from the beginning. It's something that arose in the 1890s. It took a while for that de facto disenfranchisement to arise. This is something that took place over the course of a few decades, and we're seeing the same kind of thing arising in Georgia right now. People will instantly be like, well, it's not trying to implement segregation or anything, and that's exactly how Jim Crow began, is with voter disenfranchisement. The next step is de jure segregation. De jure segregation meaning, totally segregated public spaces, anti-miscegenation laws, things along those lines. Then eventually it turns back to de facto, but using terror to enforce that kind of segregation, by making sure that people aren't crossing that line through things like lynching.
And we keep talking about all these different laws that are subliminally, what they're targeted towards, where they're being aimed at. And then just the overt was the arrest of the state representative Parker Cannon. The fear in her face as she's being carried off, because, look at Freddie Gray. He was put in the back of a police van and he just happened to die. So it's like you never know what could happen. And it's just,
Cannon was charged with obstructing an officer and preventing or disrupting General Assembly sessions or meetings of members. A.J. Griggs says they will vigorously fight these charges.
There was an attempt to silence voices, an attempt to keep people out in the most fundamental of our democracy, and that's voting.
I've tried hard to find some legal justification for this arrest, and I can't find it.
11 Alive legal analyst Paige Pate watched multiple videos from different angles, read the arrest warrants, and has come to this conclusion.
We've got three main problems with this arrest. One, she didn't do what she was charged with doing. Two, one of those laws is unconstitutional. And three, she has special protection as a member of the General Assembly. So there is no basis under the law for her arrest last night.
What about the trooper? Was he within his rights to do so?
I don't think so. Now, the trooper certainly is within his rights to instruct an individual who is creating a disturbance at the Capitol to cease the disturbance.
Just like in Reconstruction, they had to think of other ways to undermine the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which also the 13th Amendment, the way to keep slavery was, if you're imprisoned, which that's a whole other spiel we could go into about how to suppress voters right there with former convicted felons.
I am very excited today to bring you a couple of really awesome guests. I have Joseph Hall-Patton. He is a graduate assistant at the University of New Mexico and creator/host of The Cynical Historian. Also, we have Kaleb Moode, who you guys probably know, In the Mood for History. And he's a host of MMT Mondays on our own Real Progressive platform. And he's also a high school history teacher. picture. I'm curious what you guys think about, Cypher, you mentioned in the first place, you mentioned essentially, I'm not exactly sure what term you use, but, domestic terrorists, right? People how it was kind of enforced de facto in that way until it became overt. And I think, for me, that kind of struck a chord, because I think that what we've seen a lot of is a lot of things that have happened specifically and many times over, more so and much more likely to specific groups of people, right? And yet we have this kind of idea of, it's gaslighting, essentially. It's, it's this idea of, we're just going to tell you it's not happening, or we're just going to tell you that it's not happening for that reason, or whatever. And I think right now, in my perspective, and mind you, I'm not a historian, or, I don't know as much as you guys, and this is why I want to get your take on it. Is when we're talking about what's happened in the past and how it kind of translates or is reminiscent of, or today, if what's happening today is reminiscent of what happened before. Was it that kind of thing? I think, to kind of, it seems to me, looking back in history from what I know, it seems to me that it was very overt. But I think it's because I wonder if it's because I know it to be that. And I'm wondering if you have any idea if at the time it was kind of like it is today in the gaslighting and the pretending it's not happening.
Okay, so what are you referring to by gaslighting?
So when I'm
And
talking about
saying
gaslighting is when people talk about issues that are happening to specific groups in our country, especially BIPOC communities, and when things like that happen. I mean, we're having a huge reckoning right now, I think, with police violence, and I don't know exactly how you feel about that, but I'm going to bring it up right now. The idea that
an
this
entire
is
episode on
much
it.
more to predominantly to minorities and people of color, and so. But yet what we hear a lot of times, and I want to be honest, I think really right up until George Floyd, even on, from all sides, you would essentially hear, well, we don't know if that's why, and, it's just constantly this kind of mystery where there really is no mystery, like where statistically it's not a mystery, like what's happening.
It is the strongest anti-rioting, pro-law enforcement piece of legislation in the country.
This morning in Polk County, Governor Ron DeSantis signed a controversial anti-riot bill into law. The law penalizes local governments that interfere with law enforcement efforts to contain riots. It prohibits defacing monuments and other historic property. It also increases criminal penalties for assaulting law enforcement officers and prevents people accused of rioting from bailing out of jail until after their first court appearance.
You're going to jail. We're going to hold you accountable, and we're not going to end up like Portland, where this is just a daily occurrence where these people are doing this.
Members of Black Lives Matter Restoration Polk tell me the law is a direct violation of their First Amendment and restricts political dissent.
This is an intimidation tactic. This is a violation of the First Amendment, and this is targeting Black citizens that want to protest the widespread issue of police brutality.
The group is currently in Minnesota protesting the deadly police shooting of Daunte Wright. They tell me within minutes of arriving at the protest, they were arrested, even though they were not involved in any violence. They believe the anti-riot law here in Florida will only allow police officers to abuse their power.
I've seen this personally firsthand. I think that's why it's so important that we push back against this bill, because they, like you said, they have the strongest bill right now in the nation, and in Minnesota they don't even have those protocols, and they're just doing it willingly. So you're basically giving them the permission to do whatever they want to willingly. And that's really going to become a problem.
It could also come at a cost for taxpayers. A new fiscal analysis warns the legislation could cost Florida taxpayers millions of dollars. The report projects that 270 to 720 additional prison beds will be occupied by people jailed under the enhanced penalties, with an incarceration cost of up to $17.5 million per year to taxpayers. Proponents of the law say justice outweighed the cost. In Polk County, Rebecca Petit, ABC Action News.
I would certainly not call police brutality an attempt to, suppress. That's a very different realm of domestic violence. But the there have certainly been times in which the police have been deeply involved in terrorism, especially during the what's often called the nadir of race relations, which right when police were becoming a force, because you have to understand police weren't really the first police department in the U.S. was in Boston in like the 1830s, and most cities didn't even have police until right around the turn of the century, and most towns didn't have it until well into the 20s.
Mhm.
So this is a thing that took a while, but you still had sheriffs, you still had night watchmen, you had marshals, all kinds of different forms of law enforcement beyond police. But especially with sheriffs and police, during the nadir of race relations, which is roughly the Wilson administration, that you see this incredible rise in lynchings that targeted Black people. Interestingly enough, lynching wasn't actually specifically targeted towards Black people up until around the turn of the century. You'd find it was mostly just whoever was in the minority. So, for instance, here in New Mexico, the majority of lynchings were actually against non-Hispanic white people. But that's a very weird outlier, because this is one of the few places where non-Hispanic white people have always been in the minority, and are still are. But for instance, in California, it was exactly the opposite. Hispanics were specifically targeted, and lynching was kind of at its worst in California in the 1850s, but that's a totally different kind of lynching. So with all that being said, at the nadir, you see a lot of police kind of joining in. They're literally taking pictures and selling postcards of these lynchings, where everybody's just standing around the body making funny faces and everything. And oftentimes there's a policeman literally wearing his badge in the photo that they are selling. So there's this very overt, like, the police are the KKK, and stuff like that. So we don't really see that kind of thing today. That's a totally different realm of violence than today. But we are seeing the rise of groups like the Proud Boys, which are basically a white supremacist terror organization. You have other groups, the private militia movement, which is not necessarily a terror movement, but often can bleed into terror, especially white terror. A great book on this would be Kathleen Bellew's Bring the War Home, where she talks specifically about how the white power movement filtered into the white, and like this idea of trying to create a white nation state, and that ended up leading to Ruby Ridge, Waco, and the bombing of the Oklahoma City building, which also fed right into our mass shooting craze for the last decade or so. So all of this has roots in white power, but it's so different.
Mhm.
Just to kind of add off of that, you mentioned in the Wilson administration in the 19-teens and early 1920s, and you said that there was that rise in lynching. And I think that there's no coincidence that there was also the rebirth of the Klan that happened in the 19-teens and 1920s as well. And kind of go off of what you mentioned in the very beginning, Jodi, you're talking about the Klan. They got started in the 1860s. And you're talking about how that gaslighting going on. The Klan, when they were formed, the story goes that they were just formed as this whimsical group of people that just wanted to, reenact the happier times of before the war. And they were just a group of people getting together. That's how they were labeled in different books and stuff like that. But really, they were the political arm of the Democrat Party then, which then in itself, you hear conservatives today go, well, it was the Democrats that helped start the Klan, but they leave out the context of the fact of the big switch that happened. And the Democrat Party then is definitely not the Democrat Party today. There's your own form of. And it's just, I guess, going back to the Klan, they were that Democrat, that political arm of the Democrat Party during that time. And, you know,
It's important to also differentiate between the first, second, third, and depends on how you define different clans after the third. The third is post World War II. Second is 1915 to 1930s ish, and the first one's 1866 to 1871. So there's a massive difference in time between the first and second.
Oh, 100%, definitely.
And the second one isn't really a political arm of anything. It's more of a fraternal order that happens to go out and do terror every once in a while. Whereas the first one started off as a theater troupe, funny enough. Seriously. And part of the reason why they became such a force for terror was, first of all, they were formed by Confederate veterans. So, you know, they already have a particular mindset. But it was formed as a theater troupe. But when you have a bunch of masks and horses, when Black people don't have horses, one of the clear ways that that you could intimidate Black people was to ride around. For instance, in once the Enforcement Act was signed in late 1870, I think I'm getting that date right, 1870 or 1871, the army basically completely obliterated the Ku Klux Klan. No Ku Kluxers were out any further, but they turned to less overt terrorism. So they'd have the First Mounted Baseball Club, which, how do you play baseball while mounted? So you'd have things like that. They'd feed into organizations like the White League and the Red Shirts, who are really the ones who force that kind of de facto disenfranchisement that we were speaking about earlier. But it's important to realize that these are very different organizations. That the Klan of the 1860s and the Klan of 1915 are very different things. Like, it's the most popular spot for the Klan in 1922 at its height was Indiana. So it's sometimes called the Indiana Klan. It's like, even though it was widespread, something like 2% of America was members. So it's massive organization. But it takes a very different route. Like in 1922, if you're like in San Francisco, where there's Klansmen marching, they're not marching for trying to go after those darn Catholics like they were in Indiana. They're marching to go after those damn Mexicans, So the hatred took many forms, but in the South, it took a very particular form, and that was anti-Black.
Definitely. And to kind of go off of that first iteration of the Klan that I was talking about during the Reconstruction period, they were that political arm. And in the 1868 election with Grant and Seymour, they really started to exert that political terrorism. And we see in the 3 different states they mentioned, in Louisiana, Georgia, and South Carolina, there were close to 1,000 African Americans that were murdered within that certain 1868 election as a form of political intimidation. Just to, and if I remember reading correctly, in that 1868 election in Louisiana, there was one county that had 96% of the African Americans in that one county were registered to vote. And then through Klan intimidation, and then after, Grant had the Ku Klux Klan Acts and all of that kind of stuff, they had to take those more nuanced or more subliminal tactics through legislation. That one county, it was cut down to 5% of African Americans were registered to vote. They had been purged from the polls within a 2-year period. So, I mean, I guess a midterm year period, they had been purged from having the right to vote. So it's just like it just took that transition, or just like another mask or another name from, you know, overt terrorism to they had to find more creative ways, so to speak, to attack and oppress and disenfranchise.
There is this kind of increasing bipartisan awareness that law enforcement, the excesses of law enforcement on protesters that are peaceful, can be troublesome. Do you think Ron DeSantis here is striking the right balance between free speech and actually this real need to say small business owners have gotten crushed with the expenses of some of these riots? They have put a lot of people in danger. We saw way too much violence and destruction last summer. What's the balance, and is Ron DeSantis striking it?
Well, I do want to make two distinctions. You know, I disagree, I think, with Jen that Florida voters are being taken for a ride. I think they're smarter than that. I think what they are reflecting is the concern that you just pointed out, which is in a lot of small communities, you didn't see adequate police protection. You didn't see a lot of these rioters actually get charged. Many of them that were taken into custody never ended up getting charged. And I think people are saying, why? Where is the justice for my business that got looted? You know, where is the due process for my concerns? And so I think Ron DeSantis is trying to reflect that by passing a new, set of laws designed to penalize, what is obviously rioting behavior and perhaps make it easier for the government to bring charges. Now, where I sit is I think we overcriminalize a lot of things in this country. And, I worry that an overreaction to what is a justifiable outrage. Like in the city where I grew up in upstate New York, businesses were looted. People felt they had to defend themselves and the police never showed up. You never want someone to be in that position. So we have to be careful not to overreact to that with the heavy hand of the state necessarily. That, again, you are seeing current law being used to put rioters from January 6th in solitary confinement for 23 hours. I don't think that that's appropriate.
This goes actually to a conversation Emily and I were having earlier. The fact that law enforcement failed in some of these circumstances does not justify giving law enforcement more power and more tools and criminalizing additional behavior. I look at those stats of the number of protesters who were released without being charged completely differently. I look at it as like they were swept up and they were put in jail and basically didn't, the police or whoever couldn't figure out anything that they actually did wrong in which they broke the law. So I look at that in the polar opposite way. And Jen, on your point about some of the behavior that's criminalized here, just to be really clear about what this stands, and this is from the ACLU in Florida. As you were pointing out, if you're at a protest that then turns violent through no fault of your own, you can be arrested even if you didn't engage in violent conduct and charged with a third-degree felony and face up to 5 years in prison and a loss of your voting rights for going out to a protest that through no fault of your own turns violent. That is a dramatic infringement on First Amendment rights. I fear your political analysis is correct here, though, Jen, that the way he talks about this is actually very effective, and people are really afraid for, they don't want to see lawlessness in the streets. They want things to be orderly, even as they broadly support the goals of racial equality and the goals of the Black Lives Matter movement.